Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Delphi podcast. My name is Ceteris. I'm the head of research at Delphi. I'm here with the infrastructure team now, so this is going to be a bit more, I guess, in the weeds. So we'll get a bit technical at times, but hopefully we can have a good conversation around all this. If you're a Delphi member, of course, it's on the portal. It's a 2-hour read, but definitely worth the time to the holidays coming up. Take a weekend day and kind of go through it a bit. With me is 3 analysts from the infrastructure team. In addition to myself, we got Facundo, who focused on the Ethereum portion of the report, went over L1 scaling, BeamChain, Pectra, some ZK stuff. Then we have Prasad, just basically did a deep dive into everything ZK. So, the ZK VMs, how Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana are all doing ZK, some of these new alt L1, ZK L1s that kind of going for this app chain vibe. And then we have Mohammed, wrote the section on the cryptographic renaissance. It was all around TEs, MPC, FHE, which is a lot of stuff that's kind of coming into the foreground. I guess we'll start it off. So my overall theme or opinion for 2025 is that the industry is going to these high throughput blockchains. In the past, we had Ethereum L1, which obviously is a very constrained environment. And then we had some of these alt L1s like Polygon, BSC, Avalanche and stuff. But there wasn't really this big focus on true performance until Solana kind of came around. Even things like BSC, they would kind of just jack up the gas limit to get more transactions in. But there's a lot of long-term stake growth issues with that. So Solana was the first chain that kind of came out with this thesis, we want to build a global, decentralized, performant shared state machine. And I think that over the last year, seeing Solana's success and then kind of seeing a lot of these high throughput chains in the pipeline, to me is a sign that Solana was correct in their vision on building, this general purpose performant state machine. And so now you've got Sui and Aptos, right? Sui's really been leading the charge this year for the move chains. You've got obviously Hyperliquid, which is kind of this perps app chain right now, is going to be transitioning or is attempting to transition into this performant EVM chain. You've got Monad coming out on the EVM. You've got things like Ithaca from Paradigm Team, Rise, Unichain, which is kind of this purpose-built chain, but they're going to be using TEs and they're going for performance as well. So I think you're kind of just seeing everyone realize that creating a performant shared state that everyone uses is kind of the holy grail and what most users want to use these days. I'm curious if you guys have any disagreements with that, if you think maybe there's something wrong with that thesis, if you don't think high throughput chains are the future, or maybe you're more bullish on having a bunch of app chains or something.
I think when it comes to high throughput chains, as we see in Hyperliquid, right, they initially started off as a purpose-built chain just for perps. And I guess now we're seeing a lot of different applications, spring up related to lending, Hyperfund, their own pump.fun, NFT communities, and a bunch of other things. So I think, although people say that, right, maybe Hyperliquid just has about 4 or so validators, again, it has a pretty centralized outlook from a validator point of view. But when it comes to token distribution, I think much better than a lot of other chains out there. Maybe it's not just about being high throughput. In addition to being high throughput, I think it's also about how these chains have their GTM towards their initial users. How will they reward them, retain them? And I think that's a lesson that we could also see when it comes to Say or Aptos for that matter. Again, very high throughput, but I guess they've lately been struggling a bit to get attention from applications.
That's fair. I think that there is definitely more block space than we've ever had. And so while a lot of people are going to be building these high throughput chains, obviously I still think power laws kind of will dictate this, where in the long run the top I don't know, I always say 3 to 5. It's kind of just a hand wavy answer, but I don't think it'll be a lot. I do think that the majority of financial activity will happen on a few chains. I think these high throughput EVM chains, they have a lot of challenges because the EVM just being kind of a last gen VM, there's a lot of things you have to do. Every high throughput EVM chain has basically been taking out the Merkle tree, has been creating their own custom database. Obviously, there's like some of these SVM, you have Solana, obviously, but the Move VM has really been kind of like picking up steam as not just with like Sui and Aptos, but you have Anisha coming, and that's more like app chains are using Move. You have Movement Labs coming with Move. I'm curious your take on like the different VMs, Mohammed, because I know that you wrote a pretty big deep dive on Sui. What's kind of your thoughts on this?
Right. When I looked into Sui Move, what stood out was how it allowed developers to target particular pieces of state and how those pieces of state related with other pieces of state. We're talking about accounts or smart contracts or even assets. They're pretty interlinked, and the relationship between them, whether they're controlled by a single entity or multiple entities, all of that is pretty programmable. I think that allows developers to get a little more creative in how they design applications. And I think it's also that the way Sui Move or these move chains in general have their approach towards gas fees and even state growth management is pretty interesting. Aftermath, right? They're like this Dex on Sui. I mean, they have a lot of other products, but taking the Dex product as an example, given how Sui manages state, right? It's based on a rent model. So whatever transactions users place on chain, there's a rent component that goes into them, and there is also a rebate whenever these past transactions are cleared up. So it's like getting a refund on a part of your gas fees. And that's quite something when the chain's gas fees is already quite low. So I think those dynamics are pretty interesting. And that's only possible because of, how Move allows, devs to control state. And also, I guess, the state growth management system also adds up to that.
So what do you mean by allows them to control state?
So for example, smart contracts, right? On Sui, they're called programs. So this program, it can be controlled by a single address or a set of different addresses. And tokens, for example, they are also treated as pieces of state, similar to programs, similar to wallet addresses. So you have a bunch of these, Lego pieces, on the playground. And on top of this, there's this other feature, I think that's specific to Sui Move, that's about programmable transaction blocks. What happens here is you can basically bundle multiple actions together with just a single signature. This is also due to how, Move is designed. So for example, Spring Sui, right? Liquid staking on Sui. Let's say I deposit Sui and I get MSui, for example, as an LST. I can deposit into this LST and also deposit the receipt token that I get into the lending pool within the same transaction. That is like super efficient when it comes to UX. I don't have to, keep on hitting the sign button like 10 times. It's just one click on Sui. So it also, affects user experience on that end.
Yeah, I think they've done a good job to have make it like a very clean experience like that. They also have, I know on SweetLend, your whole account is actually an NFT as well. And so that could be dangerous because you can accidentally my SweetLend account, there's like a bid on it on the NFT market. And it's like someone just thinking that you're going to accept a bid for it or something, right? But it is cool how you can move a whole account within an application to another address, right? Like you can sell your position that has all your assets and your debt and everything if you wanted to, or you just want to move keys, right? Instead of unwinding all your positions, taking all these taxable events and everything and just the operational cost of it, you can literally just move the entire account to let's say you want to move it to a multi-sig, right? So those things are kind of cool. Yeah, I do think they have a lot of good other improvements too. I think something like the move chains, to get this high performance, there's multiple factors, right? It's like the software, the hardware, kind of like the networking layer and stuff. I think that, when it comes to the networking layer, there's a lot of just physical limits that every chain is going to deal with. When people talk about Solana, they'll say, oh, well, Solana was cheaper and faster than Ethereum. Something's going to come along that's faster and cheaper than Solana, right? And it's not really that. I don't really agree that it's that simple because the step function increase from Solana to Ethereum was pretty massive. And Solana's kind of laser focused on this whole, increased bandwidth, reduced latency thing. It's not clear to me that another chain will be able to actually surpass them on that. With that being said, I have heard a lot of great things from developers about the Move VM. like the amount of code you need to do the same thing on Move versus like in Solana with the SVM is way different. Obviously, it prevents a lot of these EVM attacks, like reentrancy attacks. And so then you have like the EVM ones like Monad, Hyperliquid, Mega ETH, who have this EVM developer set. So these are kind of like the two angles that Solana is being competed with now. You have like the existing EVM ones, which I don't think will ever be as performant as maybe like the Move VM ones, but they have like a lot of like existing lock-in effect with developers and everything to kind of challenge them. So we'll see. I think it's like an exciting time if you're a user. There's like, hopefully we have all this cheap, fast block space now. Like there should be a lot that comes out over the next like 2 years, especially as like the regulatory environment kind of loosens a bit. I do think though that when it comes to competing with like a global L1, I think that like some of these single sequencer rollups like Mega ETH, Ithaca, Unichain and stuff do compete. Every chain competes for users at the end of the day and liquidity. They still don't have like this global price discovery path to like multiple concurrent proposers. And so that's why I think something like Sui is the biggest competitor to Solana versus some like high throughput rollup. Because I do think that they're just kind of like developing fundamentally different products. And, if the world demands a, decentralized NASDAQ, then that needs to be an L1 type of architecture with multiple concurrent proposers. Like it can't be an L2 to fulfill that role. If the world just wants to trade NFTs and meme coins, then, you might not need to have like a L1 for that, right? We'll see how that goes. I think this also leads into my next section was like the L2 wars. I wrote about this last year. Everyone's kind of beat it to death recently. Just like, the whole fragmentation, the infighting between different ecos. I think now what we're starting to see and what you'll just see more of is like this consolidation. Base and Arbitrum, they do 90% of the DEX volume now. They have the majority of the TVL. And then, you have these new high throughput chains coming. You have a bunch of new rollup stacks as well. So I don't know. My biggest takeaway is like there's so many chains live and coming live within the next year. As someone who thinks like the majority of activity will be a small handful of chains in the long run, there will be like some great opportunities and there will be some, I think, just straight like down only tokens and ecosystems over the next few years. So speaking about rollups though, we should talk about Ethereum. Facundo, this is you. You really dove into as our resident ETH infra guy. I think there's like a few things kind of focused on here. I think like scaling the L1, which you've seen a lot of people talk about recently. These native rollups, which are a bit different than based, and then BeamChain. So maybe like give like an overview, kind of like where it's going.
Just a small comment about the previous section that we have been talking about, the VMs and stuff like that. I think it will be really funny to see if the SVM in Solana, it will be ultimately adopted, more adopted than the EVM, right, for rollups. I think that would be an interesting outcome.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the thesis or something like Eclipse. I think the challenge is that, like, if you're a developer developing SVM, Solana's still like cheap and they're still trying to scale the L1 in perpetuity. So if you want to launch your app, it's always kind of going to make more sense as an SVM dev to launch it on Solana. Whereas in the Ethereum ecosystem, if you're an EVM dev, you don't really want to deploy on L1 unless you're some massive protocol like EigenLayer, or like the existing protocols that are there. You don't get a lot of like new deployments on L1. And then you have to like pick between these different L2s, right? And so I think that even if you believe that like the SVM and the Move VM are much better than EVM, it's still possible that the majority of Ethereum rollups still are EVM at the end of the day, just because of this kind of like dynamic where if you're a developer of Move, you probably want to go launch on Sui or Aptos. If you're doing an app chain, maybe like Anisha then. If you're like Solana, you just want to do Solana L1, and then EVM, you're going to want to do a rollup, right? So...
yeah, I mean, really deep into Eclipse, so maybe you can light me up. But why they choose to build on top of the SVM instead of the EVM? Like, because I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but all apps wheels on Ethereum, right? They will not be able to launch on Eclipse, right? Because they should fork out and just launch it because there is still a different language.
So all of Eclipse's apps right now are just straight ports from Solana. There's like Orca, Affinity. There's like 5 things, but they're all just things that are on Solana L1. The thesis with Eclipse is like you get the best of each world. Okay. We're taking the execution from Solana, which is the best part about Solana SVM. You're taking DA from Celestia, which is like the most high throughput DA layer that has like data availability sampling and stuff. And then you're taking the, whatever you want to call it, settlement, asset issuance, bridge to ETH, right? And so the theory behind that is that you're making this like, I don't know, this construction that like Frankenstein construction that has the best of each part, right? I think it's still early. They just went live in like October. But again, I think the biggest challenge is just getting people who want to build SVM to build on an Ethereum rollup instead of just Solana L1. Until like Solana has significant issues with L1 scaling, which we haven't really seen anything of that yet.
I also had a kind of comment on the previous section on high throughput chains, where I think that it's important that these chains kind of differentiate with respect to the value prop they bring. And so rollups specifically have the benefit of not having any kind of consensus and networking, and they can just reduce the latency down to 5 milliseconds, 4 milliseconds, or whatever. And so there is a category that remains open for the L2s on that point of view. On the L1s, obviously something like Solana is pretty interesting because having a completely shared state, that also has a category well reserved for the application developers to build on top of such a construction. And the third one I think is, again, these new L1s, which are fundamentally taking a new route to, instead of re-execution, there is just verifiability of ZK proofs. And then they also allow the consensus to kind of evolve a bit and allow the rollups to kind of take care of ordering. So they allow the rollups to actually capture the value of MEV. At the same time, it's highly composable and the consensus is much faster. So I think like these separate categories where each of the categories brings a completely new value proposition to the set of developers is kind of going to play out in terms of, which chains kind of die out over the next years.
Yeah. Before we get to Ethereum, maybe talk about those ZKL ones. The point about like consensus, everything. I think there's 3 you talked about, right? There's Delta, Pod, and Heil, I think.
Yeah.
I think these changes they're trying to build like basically the end state modular architecture, right? They all work kind of similarly. And so can you kind of give us like a high level on what they're doing?
Yeah, so there has been kind of evolution that I've been trying to see over the past year with Bitcoins trying to have rollups and Solana trying to have rollups. And then these new ZK focused L1s, all focused on having rollups or an ecosystem on top of it. There are a few interesting design decisions that they take because of which they kind of solve the problems which are generally attributed to modular chains. For example, the fragmentation is considered one of the big problems. Now, all these chains, they have a unified state on the L1 itself. So now basically, even if the rollups are taking care of execution, the state is not separate. And so essentially, there is no interop problems. This was similar to what I observed even on Solana, where there was Magic Block, which was just accelerating the smart contract. And I think some based booster constructions also do that. So, but these L1s are fundamentally taking that decision to, remove any kind of bridging.
Yeah. So the L1 has the shared state. Are they like rollups? Mm-hmm. It's like a shard. It's like a shard.
Yeah. I mean,
like either one of the, okay. Yeah. Do they still have their local state?
Yeah. So what happens, let's say particularly in case of Delta, it's a shared state on the L1. And in terms of the state, also they use a new database called CRDTs. But what happens is like each account can opt into a specific rollup. And what happens is like that account can only be accelerated via that domain. They call it domains. And they can essentially change the domains. But what happens is like the write access for any account only stays with a particular rollup or a domain. So what happens is there are no conflicts between the different rollups because, a particular rollup just takes care of a particular set of accounts. So it's sharding in that sense, probably.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people pretty bullish on those
Yeah.
as like the end game. Because I do think I think like shared state is kind of the point of blockchains for the most part. And so getting those kind of like working cohesively, if you're building this like ZK L1 from scratch, you can kind of fix a lot of issues that I think other ecosystems have seen. And I know like Facundo, there's a lot of ZK stuff that Ethereum is looking at for like the L1. I think they want to like snarkify the EVM and do stuff like that. So maybe we can go into kind of like Ethereum now, because Ethereum, obviously it's like the largest ecosystem, been around the longest, most liquidity, TVL, developers, all this, but it does have like a lot of tech debt, right? Which is just a natural extension of like being early and going forward. So yeah, maybe we can talk about like the Ethereum roadmap and
Yeah, sure.
what's going on
We
there.
can talk about a little bit. So just from my point of view, right, I think that lately it feels like Ethereum a lack of what crypto Twitter denominates North Star, right? Or maybe it has multiple ones. What it means is that there are not consensus among like stakeholders, right? Like researchers, core researchers, app developers, core developers, like clients, about what needs to be upgraded and what needs to be prioritized next, right? And this is something that we can clearly see in, for example, in the next hard fork, that is Spectra, is named Spectra, or even Amsterdam, that is the next one after that, or Fusaka. There's no consensus about which AYP needs to be included in those hard forks, and like core developers are constantly changing what are the upgrades that will be included, right? And this is something that we have been talking with you, Ceteris, I think, this is the nature of a truly decentralized and distributed system. But I also think that this is not exclusively to Ethereum, right? I mean, Ethereum is facing this situation because it was like the first mover.
No, I agree with you. Like the bigger you get, the more stakeholders you have with all conflicting interests and priorities. It's like, even, I know there's a lot of talk in Ethereum on pushing native rollups, which is kind of a rebrand of enshrined rollups. And I do remember a few years ago when this whole enshrined rollup versus third-party rollup, which is what we have now, the prevailing thought then was we don't want to give a leg up to any specific rollup. We want to have third parties come in, compete against each other, and that's going to like accelerate Ethereum scaling the most, right? And I think now people are coming to the realization that, hey, if Base takes all our users, that's probably not as good as if maybe Tycho took all our users. And so you are seeing this pushback to maybe like these native based rollups. And then again, like there's people who want to scale the L1 a lot, which is pushed by like an ex Ethereum person now, but it really did get the ball rolling in that ecosystem. And a lot of people have been talking about scaling the L1 a bit more, right? So yeah, I agree with your point though, that it's just the bigger you get, the more problems you're going to have, because an L2 like Base or Arbitrum wants one thing, whereas maybe like a Base or native rollup wants you to do a different thing, right? Because there are different decisions you can make that are beneficial to like one over the other, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that like this is not exclusively to Ethereum, right? It is something that will happen to other ecosystems as well. Even Solana, I think that as other ecosystems mature and grows over time, they will face these similar issues. And this is something that I state in the report, right? That is happening in Solana with I mean, it's really common to find people claiming that Solana is centralized. I said it too for a while. Although I still believe that Solana is more centralized than Ethereum, this situation of teams starting to like contributing to the ecosystem of Solana is happening with clients, right? They are diversifying with Firedancer, Hero, Agave, Helios, the ZK teams.
Yeah, I think that actually has been an issue for Solana too. Like with Firedancer, Solana core protocol kept adding in all these new like SIMDs and improvements, and like every time they add one of those in, it just delays Firedancer getting to mainnet, right? Because now they need to like incorporate all those. And so I think some of it is kind of like, hey, can we hold off on changing the core protocol until we get Firedancer live, and then we can go forward again? but it just gets more and more challenging, and you just have so many different like hands in the pie. So yeah, no, I agree with that mindset. I kind of want to talk about the BeamChain and the ZK snarkifying Ethereum, because I think the BeamChain, I don't know, maybe it was like overhyped or something. I know people don't like the 5-year timeline and all this.
Yeah. I mean, I think the BeamChain proposal is from Justin, right? It's really cool. But I think that some specific things and the context in which it was presented overshadow somehow the proposal, right? For example, the hype, like you said, the wild around the proposal, the momentum in which it was presented. But I think that the worst part of it, not for me because I don't really agree with this sentiment, it was the 5-year roadmap, right? Justin said that the motivation for introducing this BeamChain proposal, he said that it was to introduce a new meme, right, in a recent podcast that I don't really remember which one, to unify the Ethereum community, right, and to give them a clear North Star that it lacks currently, in the same way that it was previously with the merge, for example, right? I unified everyone was agreeing in which was the big thing that Ethereum was going to be upgraded. The main criticism around the BeamChain was the 5-year thing, right? As far as I know, this proposal, first, it is meant to replace the Bitcoin chain, that is the consensus chain, right? And second, it will be bundled all together. So all these proposals and upgrades will be bundled all together in this 5-year roadmap. And so that's kind of weird, to be honest. I don't like that part, but I don't think this is going to be the case. I think that there will be a lot of, let's say, intermediate upgrades across all 3 sub-layers, like the execution sub-layer, consensus, and data availability, in the middle to be implemented first in the Bitcoin chain. I think that the 5-year roadmap is going to be the couple.
Yeah, like it'll take 5 years in total, but you'll get progress throughout the way. And so it's not like you're going from present state for 5 years and then on the 5th year you're getting everything.
Nah,
right?
it doesn't make
not going to
sense
happen
to
like
me.
that. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I think what Justin was trying to do is just by bundling all together is into a single proposal is to create a shilling point for the Ethereum again. So that makes sense, but it was not the desired outcome, right?
Yeah, and I think the holy grail here is around like snarkifying the L1, right?
Yeah. So I mean, the main upgrades the proposal introduced, I think that they are, at least for me, from my point of view, and the most important ones are to reduce the staking requirements to 1 ETH, to snarkify the chain, that we can go over in more detail what it means later, and pre-confirmations that Justin claimed that they will be giving Ethereum faster than Solana transactions confirmation, right? So yeah, the major advantage by what it means to snarkify the chain, I think that the major advantage by doing it is that everything will be CK, right? Every single thing in the EVM will be CK consumed. What this means is that any entity which consumes Ethereum, namely nodes, for example, can do it with extremely low resources by verifying just a single proof instead of verifying and executing the whole transaction or block. I mean, this is really cool, but my main concern, and this is something that I talk in the report, is that this upgrade introduces these CK vendors, right, that are those specialized nodes, right, that will be generating all these proofs to validate transactions or even like entire blocks. So that's my main concern, because nodes will need to verify only these proofs, right, instead of all transactions. But it could be a centralization force for Ethereum, right?
Yeah, I think it can be similar like how block building is done by 2 builders today, right?
Weaver and what is it?
Yeah.
Titan.
Yeah, and you can just have, I guess, like a couple people or entities generating all the proofs, right?
Yeah, but I don't really know. Maybe I'm not that deep into this, but maybe you can light me up a little bit. But I don't know if that is a concern, right? Because of the nature of TK proofs and self-verifying. I'm not sure if that is if it is the same scenario that we are facing with the block building, right?
I know, Mohammed, you wrote about proof markets. Like, do you think that they're going to be centralizing over the long run? How do you kind of see the proof markets playing out?
So I think when it comes to proof markets, there are maybe a couple of ways, in which they can build moats potentially. I mean, none of them are live to a very significant extent right now. We're just, getting started, in that phase. But I think a couple of examples are like a proof market that has better liveness or has a greater diversity of, the requirements that it can fulfill when it comes to, proving requirements. That will have an advantage over a proof market, let's say, that are liveness issues or, fewer, proving mechanisms. Because on the other end of a proof market, what you have is nodes, right? Prover networks that are, paying for a lot of hardware, a lot of specialized hardware, and a lot of research is going into, making hardware more efficient with VPUs, better GPUs. All of these guys on the prover network end, they'll need to have better returns. And that will be possible if, the proof market as a whole has better liveness guarantees. So they could justify, running their prover node for 24 hours a day throughout the year in terms of, their ROI. And I guess when it comes to, different ZK VMs, each of them have their own, trade-offs, I guess, or different constraints, different costs, different execution speeds. All of this will also, come into the picture. But I don't think this will be an issue because it's just a matter of allowing a particular, set of, nodes to basically run all of these different, I guess, proving algorithms or circuits. I think Prasad could, dive more into that. But yeah, I think what we're seeing right now is as a proof cycle gets started, where there is a lot of increase in demand for proving, both from the application side and also the infrastructure side. Infra, I'd say, like a lot of these rollups, we also have a lot of optimistic rollups, go on with hybrid proving. There's Tycho, there's Optimism with SP1, and there'll be a bunch of others. There's also a requirement for, ZK proving on the data availability end, with Celestia, for example, working with Succinct. And I think applications will also, be a big component of this proof demand. But I wouldn't say it's all applications, it's just some applications. And why is that? Because some applications, they prioritize having private state. Let's say a dark pool, for example, they wouldn't really, benefit from having their, proving requirements offered to a proof network. Because that would basically, expose their order book, for example. Stuff like that would be limited to, the application itself. But if you look at, world chain, for example, a lot of their demand might end up going to these, proof markets. The same for, I guess, general purpose privacy applications, for that matter, like maybe Panther or Railgun. And all of this feeds into proof markets that then distribute this demand into, different prover networks that have paid a lot for these prover nodes, paid a lot for hardware acceleration, better proving systems, all of which would lead to a lower proving cost, because when you have, sufficient enough of a demand, that would make it more cost efficient for these prover networks to, push out proofs. And I think I see this, feeding into a cycle where each of these things feed into the other. And I think we're already seeing it play out.
Yeah, that was good.
I do have a couple of thoughts on this.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think from a centralization point of view, first one is that the RISC-V ZK VMs are currently dominating the space a lot, because Succinct and RISC-0 are the current dominating ones. But there's probably a growing concern about this dominance. And also, for example, Tycho has multi-provers, and so eventually rollups will require like multi-provers for their proofs. And so there'll be like similar to the client diversity on the Ethereum nodes themselves. There'll be like client diversity in terms of the different ISAs that they select. So it could be like something based on Cairo, something based on RISC-V, so SP1 and RISC-0 and so on. So there'll be like a diversity on that side, which will be demanded probably by the rollups themselves, because they they wouldn't want any particular implementation to be threatening to the proof system itself, and the verification of the rollup. And the second point is with respect to the proof markets. What I observed was there was like 3 or 4 different categories of proof markets. So first one is like the ZK VMs themselves, since they have a lot of the demand side, the applications, they try to develop their own proof markets because that's one of the ways, or mostly the only way to make money out of the ZK VMs. So we are seeing this play out in Succinct and Risk Zero, where they are trying to build their decentralized prover markets.
Yeah, why don't you actually explain what a ZK VM is?
So basically, in very simple terms, ZK VM is just like running a program inside a VM and then taking all the something called as trace. So basically, all the intermediate steps and everything, and then just generating a ZK proof on top of it, that everything was executed properly.
Right. And so the idea is that like you do all this complex stuff essentially like off chain in a sense, and then you just put this single proof on chain and it proves like for correctness, validity and everything. And so that's how you kind of get a lot of scalability, right?
Yeah. And the big change was from a circuit based approach to a ZK VM, which got started the last year. Because initially developing the circuit was just like too tedious, required so many cryptographers and so on.
So a circuit is like building a specific thing for a specific type of proof you're doing, right? And so every time you want a different proof or a different application, you need to get this new circuit built, right? Versus like ZKVM, it's more generalizable. You build for the VM, you just prove the VM, and it's like, that's the distinction, right?
Yep.
Between the two.
Yeah. And one thing is like having this standardization is liked by everyone. So it's also the application developers, because they can just write programs in Rust or C, so they don't have to write using any ZK focused language. So that opens up the space for developers. And on the hardware side, also hardware also kind of loves having a very specific target for a VM instead of optimizing for different kind of circuits. So the GPUs and VPUs or ASICs can just focus on accelerating just like some modular components out of a VM. So it's like both the application side as well as the hardware acceleration side kind of loves that standardization in between.
Yeah, that's good stuff. If you want to learn more about all this, definitely read the report, because Prasad wrote like a good hour on ZKVM stuff. There's a couple things I want to go over before we finish here. First, I kind of want to talk about how each ecosystem is using ZK, and then after I want to go to some of the FHE stuff with Mohammed. I think like, obviously there's like a broad ZK infra being built for the entire industry, but Ethereum, Bitcoin, and Solana are all kind of using it in different ways, right? So I think it'd be helpful context to like understand how each of these ecosystems is planning or is using ZK right now.
Mm-hmm. So I would say Ethereum, since it was almost like the birthplace of ZK, because Ethereum had these restrictions in terms of the execution, so that led to a lot of focus on the ZK side. So Ethereum has a very wide range of use of ZK. So starting from snarkifying the L1 itself, the consensus and the execution side, as well as for individual rollups. So all the optimistic rollups on top of Ethereum, they're going to get converted into ZK rollups, because the only thing that is kind of stopping them right now to get converted to ZK is just the cost factor, which is like around 10x more expensive. But coming next year, we are going to see a lot of improvements on the cost side, which will just make it a no-brainer for OP rollups to get converted to ZK rollups. And the third one is interop, because Ethereum has this biggest problem of interop between the rollups and fragmentation. And so on that side, we have AG layer and ZK-Lite clients. So that kind of fixes, issues on everything on Ethereum. So on the base layer itself, interop between the rollups and the rollups themselves.
Yeah, so AG layer is kind of like, it's made by Polygon. They're pitching it as this neutral infra, which it definitely can be. Basically, all the chains can issue their assets on like this one AG layer thing, and then when you're bridging between different chains that are using the AG layer, you just use the proof, and like they share it all. They have some of these failure handy rails or whatever things in place where you can't like take out more assets that are on your chain and things like that. I think it's an elegant design. I think the biggest challenge is just like yesterday, Superchain launched Superchain ERC20, right? And it's just you have these standards for each ecosystem. And you kind of saw this with the bridging too. Like Layer 0 has these OFT tokens that if you use their standard, you can burn and mint it easily across all these chains, right? And so there's that meme, right? About, oh, there's 15 standards. I've created the 16th to solve everyone's problems, right? And so that'll be the biggest, I think, issue there. But yeah, I agree with your point that it seems like the optimistic rollups are going to all be ZK. I think the pace of development for fraud proofs and getting to like stage 2 rollups has been pretty disappointing. And the speed at which ZK has been like, I think it's blown past like everyone's expectation, how fast it's kind of come along. And yeah, it does make sense that all of these are basically going to be ZK rollups. I don't know about the next year, but within the next few years, I think definitely you'll see that more. Maybe we can move to Bitcoin. I think the big ZK angle with Bitcoin is like OpCat.
Yeah. So, I mean, Bitcoin, unlike Ethereum, people are not so much focused on general purpose applications on top of Bitcoin, though that is also an interesting space. But more important is like the bridging aspect of Bitcoin itself outside of the ecosystem, because currently it's just multi-sigs and it's not trustless. There are fortunately 3 different directions in which research has been done on bringing ZK verifiability. First one is obviously OpCat. And there's a lot of fight between the community if to not bring on top of, because it requires protocol changes. But Starkware is working pretty hard on it, and it's quite elegant. And compared to the other aspect, which is BitVM, it would be much better because it would just like straight up verify the ZK proofs instead of relying on optimistically, just relying on a set of actors to watch all the transactions and then have them have the window itself, right? And there was one more approach which was recently described, which is called Kaleidoscript. And unlike OpCat, it won't require any kind of protocol change. So it uses like clever tricks inside of Bitcoin, but the only problem is that it's not financially viable. Like it's going to require like $5 million to verify a single proof. So, but I think it's good to have this diversity in terms of approach, and just figure out which one gets there faster. And I think, a lot of work is being done to bring Bitcoin trustlessly out of Bitcoin itself.
Yeah, you don't really need like Bitcoin. I don't know if you need Bitcoin rollups per se that use like Bitcoin DA and everything, but if you can just bridge Bitcoin, that is like all you kind of need, I think, for a lot of this stuff. So that'll be pretty good. And then lastly, I think Solana, they have some like compression. They have these extensions. Maybe we can go over quickly what Solana is using ZK for, because I think a lot of people don't think Solana has any ZK stuff, right? Because they don't have ZK rollups, but they're using it in different ways, right?
Mm-hmm. So Solana is a late entrant into the ZK space because I think about 6 months back they introduced these syscalls which will be able to verify ZK proofs. So it's a relatively new entry. But I would say because Solana does not have the problem of execution as a bottleneck because SVM is pretty performant. So they are tackling it on a different side, which is the state rent itself. So all the transactions basically have to have the state on top of Solana right now, but instead they'll be using an off-chain ledger and reducing the costs of holding the state on top of Solana. And so basically instead of entire state itself, it will just have like small commitments on top of Solana. So reducing cost by what they call as 5,000x, which should be crazy. Solana already being much cheaper. This is going to take it to completely next level. And also it kind of preserves the benefits of Solana itself because Solana has this parallel processing and so it's the ZK compression doesn't necessarily kind of change anything in terms of functionality on top of Solana. So you just get like pure cost improvements.
Yeah, I think actually a good example where they could use that is today with the Pudgy Penguins airdrop. Because Solana has these, first of all, I mean, high level, Solana blocks at 48 million compute units. This is kind of like an arbitrary measurement, whatever. And then they limit each account to 12 million per block, right? And then they also have like limits on compute units in a certain transaction or something. And so basically the Pudgy Penguin airdrop is only able to get like 50 to 60 transactions per block, okay, which is like 140 per second or something, which is pretty low, right? And a lot of that's because you're bumping up against these like compute limits and everything. And if they use like ZK compression to do this airdrop, and then you could essentially do like everything in the one, right? So I think those are the kind of unlocks. I do think it's interesting how Solana, all these things they're doing with like the ZK, with extensions, for the most part, it's still about keeping stuff on the L1, right? Even like these ephemeral rollups, it's like, hey, you do some liquidation on this ephemeral rollup, you bring it back on L1. I think Bullet by Zeta Team is one that's like actually an app chain, right? Most of these other Solana modularity ZK stuff are kind of in different zones. Bullet will be interesting to see. I think perps chains, it always makes sense to do an app chain for that. That's like the one use case. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there in Solana land for ZK. So we'll definitely be interested to see how that goes. I know there's some privacy stuff there too that is kind of enabling. On the privacy sector, I want to finish this off with Mohammed. He's kind of like the privacy king, wrote about dark pools a while ago, has been digging deep into FHE and everything. So I think, you know, one of the one part in your section that I found really interesting was this like private ERC20, right? So maybe you can talk about like FHE, how it differs from ZK and how it's kind of being used in some of these like privacy preserving use cases.
So with FHE, the idea is that you basically compute over private data, and you and the nodes, right? They come together with an output, and the thing here is that this is commonly seen with both MPC and ZK. It's that there are a bunch of different, MPC or FHE algorithms. Again, I think we could take the same ZK example where, you have a bunch of different type of, ZK circuits maybe that are suited for certain use cases. It's more or less the same with, MPC and FHE. And another, design pattern we've been seeing with these two are, co-processors, where co-processors basically handle, the complexities of choosing between different, algorithms, be it MPC or FHE, and they also, take care of, the distributed key generation process or, the threshold decryption process with their own set of nodes. Both of which are, pretty pivotal in actually making MPC or FHE useful. So for applications that are looking to, make use of MPC or FHE for, privacy or collaborations over shared state, these co-processors are their, go-to products. We've got maybe Fairblock and Gateway on the MPC side, and Inco and Zama on the FHE side. So I guess now going into confidential ERC20s by Inco, the process is pretty straightforward, where the sender basically sends their ERC20s to an FHE contract that wraps the contract, basically hiding its balances, and then thereafter hiding the user that sent the ERC20s themselves. This could be done in both ways, like wrapping existing ERC20s or minting new confidential ERC20s. The primary use case for this is payments. I think Inco they've been looking into this with Circle on making this happen, where you can use stables to make let's say salary payments or vendor or service provider payments just on chain directly. And this because if you do this without confidentiality, you would basically be revealing what an employer is paying to a bunch of his other employees. It would be a hot mess for all of those people involved in those situations.
Yeah, I think not just for like personal privacy, also just businesses in general. They're paying different like suppliers or whatever. These are all trade secrets, right? These aren't things that if you see your competitor is sending money to some you're like, oh, why are they doing that, right? You're leaking a ton of information. And so I've always felt that, privacy always gets this. People think of Tornado Cash, they think of laundering money. That's the thing that comes to everyone's mind. That's not, businesses will never transact on chain if they're not getting basic confidentiality and like privacy, right? So I think this is like a big thing that needs to get fixed.
Right. And the interesting part here is that you could programmably, encrypt these transfers. For example, the sender or the receiver, meets a certain age requirement or has a certain, identity requirement that could be ZK verified, off chain. And, these transfers would be, complete only when these certain, requirements are met. So that's the thing about, programmable cryptography or encryption. It just opens up a very, very large, landscape for private state, collaborations. Yeah, I think, blind auctions are something, that could be an interesting use case coming out of it. I think developers will have to get really creative on this end. Maybe something like what MetaDAO has been doing, but let's take the same level of, maybe creativity and put that on with, private chain states. Where could that lead us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see I'm excited to see how the privacy. I think also with the Tornado Cash, they got a bit of a win in the courts, but like you can't sanction a smart contract. I think we'll see a lot more experimentation, development in this area, and that's like needed. And we can move past the thinking everyone who wants privacy for something is a criminal and all that. So that'll be good. With that though, I think we're gonna end it here, just over an hour. This was only a small portion of everything that was in the report. It would take us probably a 10-hour podcast if we wanted to go through everything. So once again, like, be sure to check it out on the portal. If you wanna read the whole thing, it is definitely the most in-depth infra year ahead report that is out there. Once again, I want to thank Facundo, Prasad, and Mohammed for their work on this, and also just coming on the pod today to talk about it. And to listeners, be on the lookout we got a DeFi one coming, DeFi report and podcast coming, and we got the last one's going to be the DePIN DEAI one, which I know AI has been a super hot sector lately. So be on the lookout for those. And thanks for listening.